Thank you for your kind introduction, Miriam. Okay. In 2019, Holocaust studies has become a well-established field with a series of university-based programs and centers, memorials, endowed professorships, academic journals, conference series, including, of course, this very one on the Future of Holocaust testimonies we are attending here today, and a steady stream of books in Israel, North America, and large parts of Europe and beyond. Despite the supposed stresses brought on by the ongoing growth of genocide studies, seemingly challenging the singularity of the Holocaust, or an approaching future with no survivors in our midst, the state of the field is strong. So there are two phenomena partially related that stand out to me and that deserve more attention and therefore will be at the center of this paper. The first one, in the vast majority, historians, and again I repeat, historians of the Holocaust, still display a striking, and now with apologies to the late French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, incredulity towards theory. No matter what its current label might be, from the linguistic to cultural turns, or anything beyond empiricism and its aesthetics or core methodological reflections. Yet empiricism in itself constitutes a scientific system of theories, albeit I would add a flawed one. It is a system that cannot, as Gregor McLellan reminds us, account for the significance it attributes to the selection, distribution, and weighing of facts in historical studies. Indeed, it does not allow us to adequately reflect on conceptual, epistemological, discursive, ideological, or ontological questions that underpin the practice of any study of history, including, of course, the study of the Holocaust. The work by a prominent historian in the field, such as Christopher R. Browning, might be case in point. His fascinating 2010 monograph, Remembering Survival Inside a Nazi Slave Labor Camp, mentioned by a number of the speakers, and rightfully so, in the course of this conference, completed on the basis of his analysis of post-war Jewish survivor accounts, and with the almost complete absence of contemporary German sources, constructed a stable, quote, core memory of survivors, the analysis of which still, he admitted rather vaguely, required, quote, some reasonable judgment on the part of the historian. Second, despite decades of the practice of gender analysis in the study of the Holocaust, and again as stressed by historians, beginning with the pioneering work of scholars such as John Ringelheim, a number of you know, the founding director of oral history at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s, and landmark collections such as Dalia Offers, the past president of Hebrew University's Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and also Leonard Weitzman, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, the Women in the Holocaust landmark study of the late 1990s. Gender is still regarded as rather marginal by many in the study of the Nazi regime's genocide of European Jewry, and strikingly disconnected, to use the metaphor by Doris Bergen, of the core of Holocaust studies. Again, Christopher Browning's Remembering Survival serves as a good example. It devotes 7 pages to a chapter entitled Childbirth, Abortion, Sex and Rape. And then another 7 pages to the Stachauerwitze Women and Children in Birkenau. And none of these sections, I might add, has any core of the main argument of this important book. Now, I hasten to add, of course, that there are enough prominent established scholars who wouldn't even include such a chapter in the first place. So on their grounds, of course, then even the use of survivor testimony remains largely gender blind. By contrast, John Ringelheim, again, many of you will remember, had set out conducting an ambitious program of oral histories, or rather herstories, as she wrote to, quote, recapture the Holocaust experience as a whole, and to, quote, establish women's sense of their particular and different, of course, experiences within it. Furthermore, leading voices in the practice of women's and gender history, such as the American historian Joan W. Scott, did nothing short of calling the very concepts that underpinned the social sciences into question. Drawing on theorizations by the late French philosopher Jacques Derrida, their anti-foundationalism aimed at demonstrating how the construction of gender relations and differences constituted a, if not the primary way, again drawing on Scott's classical conceptualization, in which power is articulated. In short, then, from the start, feminist practices of gender analysis and its uses to reconceptualize the study of the Holocaust has not only been characterized by a turn to self-reflexive methodologies, also, of course, in the study of survivor testimony, but an inherently and profoundly theoretical endeavor. Why then, and of course you can disagree with my premise, and we can, if we have some time for questions, of course, hash it out then, have gender and gender relations, generally speaking, remained rather marginal in the study by historians of the Holocaust, and why did they fail to dislodge, in Zoe Waxman's fitting words, the, quote, overwhelmingly male narrative by historian study of that subject? And more importantly, how can gender, also and especially in the study of survivor testimony, help us rethink the, quote, core of Holocaust studies, its connections to its multiple margins, in some of the field's key conceptual distinctions, such as Wall Hilberg's conventional trias of the perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, distinctions that, of course, several papers at this conference already started to call into questions. Towards these end, then, this paper begins to reassess the significance of gender difference and dynamics in Jewish responses, or responses rather by German Jews and other Germans of Jewish ancestry to the persecution by the Nazis and other fascist regimes, and secondly also in post-genocidal testimony alike. More specifically, it examines petitioning practices as remembered and discursively constructed in survivor testimony as one critical yet often minimized response by this persecuted population during the Nazi regime's early years, the radicalization of anti-Jewish persecutions, and in the period of the Shoah, of course, then moving from the center of the European continent, following in a way Gerhard Weinberg, if you wish, to the alleged margins of the Holocaust in Southeast Asia. It's based on analysis of interviews with survivors conducted by the authors over the past 20 years, and also older testimonies as found in archives, most prominently, of course, that of Yad Vashem. The paper shows not only the extent to which these acts were gendered, and situate them in the shifting gender regimes in pre-war Nazi Germany or the wartime Philippines under Japanese occupation. It also places them at the center of the kind of integrated histories of the Holocaust, with multiple combined perspectives of various groups of actors, from perpetrators to victims, called for and practiced by prominent scholars such as Scholl Friedlander and, of course, also Dan Michman, who was kind enough to join us today. Without ignoring the real power differentials, these entreaties as distinctly gendered acts emerge as far more complex and consequential than much of the previous scholarship has acknowledged. And finally, the paper combines this approach with a partially self-reflexive reading of the discussed testimonies that, drawing now on the work of scholars such as Pascal Rachel-Bose, shifts the emphasis from gendered responses to gendered memories and narratives, gendered narratives of survivors. In other words, the most distinctive expression of gender difference may not be manifested in the practices of the 1930s and 40s, but in the way in which survivors decided to narrate or erase their memories and experiences in the 1950s and 2000s. This approach, then, the paper maintains, represents another step in connecting gender back to the core of Holocaust studies. So two brief parts. The first one, on gender, Holocaust histories, and marginality. Given the clear confines of a short conference paper, this is of course not the time to advance a nuanced and substantial analysis of the ongoing marginality of gender analysis in the work of many Holocaust historians. A few brief remarks therefore shall suffice. First, even the limited scope, limited in scope, academic elaborations on gender in the Holocaust of the 80s and 90s by scholars aforementioned from Ringelheim to Weizmann prompted an almost immediate backlash that extended far beyond scholarly discourse. Perhaps the harshest and most damaging criticism, as many of you undoubtedly remember, came in fact from female Jewish authors and survivors of all genders alike. Cynthia Ossek, for example, accused Ringelheim and other feminist historians of the Holocaust of, quote, asking morally wrong questions that lead us still further down the road of eradicating Jews from history and memory. Ossek, in fact, went as far as linking Ringelheim to Holocaust deniers by saying that, quote, it didn't happen to just Jews, but to women who also happened to be Jewish. Many survivors and also female Jewish Holocaust survivors joined in basically and then emphasized that they were all persecuted and of course exterminated by the millions simply because they were Jews and that there were no differences. Much of the subsequent scholarship then of course unfolded with an air of defensiveness, to say the least. Second, and directly related, Holocaust historians from Lipstadt to Richard Evans became increasingly involved, again, as most of you know, in trials of outright Holocaust deniers since the late 1980s, serving often as historical expert witnesses or even defendants. The circumstance that deniers like Ernst Zündel leaned on literary scholars and their crude readings of post-structuralism only seemed to confirm this incredulity towards theory, feminist and non-feminist alike. And some prominent scholars, again like Chris Browning, partially explained their penchant for painstakingly detailed archival work and clinging closely to the documents, as he phrased it, with their appearances in these trials. In the sense that feminist scholarship was portrayed as yet another ideological project willing to trivialize and subject the Holocaust to a political agenda. Third, Holocaust historians responded only reluctantly and much belatedly to the challenges, for example, of the linguistic turns in the humanities and social sciences that also underpinned the approaches to gender as elaborated on by scholars like Scott. The influential interdisciplinary conference on challenges to the representation and study of the Holocaust that Charles Friedlander, another renowned Holocaust historian, child survivor, again known to most of you, convened at UCLA only took place in the spring of 1990. Ultimately, Friedlander remained rather ambiguous about the topic. He argued that it was, quote, precisely the final solution which allowed postmodernist thinking to question the validity of any totalizing view of history. There remained an ultimate indeterminacy of these extreme events that Friedlander had already revealed in his earlier calls to the study of mythic memory and voices of Jewish victims. Consequently, he closed with literary critic Shoshana Feldman's admonition that truth did, quote, not kill the possibility of art and the convergence of the discourses of historians and fiction writers, but, quote, required it for transmission, for its realization in our consciousness as witnesses. Part 2, connecting back to the core, gender petitioning and integrative Holocaust histories. Women's and gender historians alike have made, of course, immense contribution to our understanding and how Jewish women experienced and suffered during the Shoah. Yet their readings of women's Holocaust testimonies, again going back to Zoe Waxman, also often have remained too women-centered, and one might add self-marginalizing, for focusing on their role of caregivers, mothers, and forgers of surrogate families in the camps, for example. By contrast, the more recent focus on sexuality and sexual violence, Jakob's, of course, presentation earlier gave you more than a very strong glimpse in this direction, as a core part of genocide, and partially linked to the elevation of rape to a concept of international law, and key part of the definition of genocide by the ICTY proceedings against perpetrators in the former Yugoslavia during the 1990s, represents one way to reconnect gender to the study of gendered mass violence, to the core of Holocaust studies. Now, in the remaining minutes, however, I want to pursue a different direction that connects gender, agency, petitioning, and integrated histories in the analysis of survivor testimony. One sunny afternoon in late July 2001, I spent hours on the back porch of the middle-class home of two elderly sisters in Weinheim, German Southwest, and interviewed them about their and their family struggles in the Nazi state. I had been introduced to them by the daughter of the World War I veteran born into a German-Jewish family in the Kingdom of Württemberg at the time, who had disturbingly, eagerly, and without coercion worked for the SD, the secret service of the SS in Stuttgart, during much of the war, so akin to Stella that Professor Weinberg talked about. In the course of the interview, the two recounted the vivid memory of how, during the early months of the Hitler regime, Marlies Morala, the late mother, and her sister Marlies Runge had boarded a train to Munich, and I changed the names, they asked me to. The two women made their way to the hotel in which, so at least they had heard, Hitler was staying for the duration of a meeting of party leaders. The, quote, blonde and blue-eyed Morala, her daughters stressed in the 2001 interview, managed to convince the innkeeper to place her petition on a table in Hitler's hotel room. In her entreaty, also confirmed by a stack of documents they shared with me, the 37-year-old Morala pleaded with the Führer to order Württemberg's Minister of Education, Christian Mergenthaler, to reinstate her sister's husband as the senior teacher, Oberstudienrat, at Esslingen's high school. The previous weekend, Morala and her sister had celebrated the confirmation of 4 of their daughters in the local Protestant church, so conversion, right? The sister's neighbor, a dentist, had denounced Runge's husband to the education ministry. The Runge family, the men required, had agreed to have their daughters confirmed, quote, with Jews. In response, ministry officials had removed him from the teaching position. Morala, then the daughter of an old Protestant Württemberg family, was married to the director of a local paper manufacturing plant who had converted from Judaism a few years earlier. Categorized then as non-Aryans, nonetheless, by Nazi racial law, the daughters, along with the entire nuclear family, were swiftly singled out by their Gentile neighbors and party activists in their search for Jews in the small hometown. There was no synagogue and no community to speak of. Brushing off the petition, Hitler nonetheless had Morala referred to Württemberg's education minister, who was also staying in Munich. Morala allegedly managed to board Mergenthaler's return train to Stuttgart and made her way to the minister's seat. She orally repeated the petition and was supposedly granted her brother-in-law's reinstatement. Now, this, of course, is a narrative that very, very closely followed the shared memories of the two interviewees. And in itself, in its retelling, is, of course, highly problematic as well as insightful at the same time. It is a highly mediated memory, of course. After all, the two interviewees were not present on the train in Munich, and like all memory itself is highly presentist. And some of the wording, it doesn't really capture the thick Swabian accent that the two had. Always stressed over and over again, aber meine Mutter war sehr tapfer, but my mother was very courageous. Und zusammen mit ihrer Schwester sah sehr arisch aus, blond, blauäugig, sehr hübsch, right? So looked very Aryan, blonde, blue-eyed, and very pretty. Genau. So she's stressing this overall, right? So unsere Mutter war so eifrig und tapfer, dass sie sich nicht abhalten ließ. So our mother was, so eager and courageous that she was unstoppable, right? So the daughter, meanwhile, recounted this narrative episode against the backdrop, one shall not forget, of her own recent struggle against rising anti-Semitism and racism in post-unification Germany, only a few years right after the completed unification, and her car, in fact, being covered with swastikas and anti-Jewish slurs, to which she had herself then stood up and kind of modeled her behavior here on those recounted behaviors of her late mother. What the account further downplayed, however, is the subject position of Württemberg's Nazi education minister. While he seemingly granted the request, he also reasserted his patriarchal role and power by introducing preconditions for, in fact, granting this petition request. That prompted Morala's extended, very pious Christian family to intensely pressure her to agree, quote, to divorce her, quote, Jewish husband. As the sisters recall, their mother steadfastly refused, but soon collapsed from severe depression in the course of the growing social isolation. So on the one hand, then the testimony ascribed an agency to the mother that problematized simplified categorizations of victim categories, further confirmed then by their families' rather hybrid racial status. On the other hand, no matter how mediated, the social memory is also embedded in an interactive and integrated dynamic that brings to the fore a renegotiated exercise of power and reasserted masculinity on the part of local Nazi politicians at a time of early discrimination practices, remembered some 70s later, in rather distinctly gendered forms. These dynamics of gender, power, agency, or memory also play out, final point, as powerfully and consequentially in a second testimony, which in fact draws then your attention, so before then offering some concluding remarks. In 2017, I interviewed another survivor about a different set of petitioning practices, again distinctly gendered, as it quickly became apparent in Beit Moses' parents' home on Bethlehem Road in Jerusalem. The 86-year-old Margaret Pins-Kestenbaum had escaped Breslau as a young girl with her parents, one might add, of course, to Manila, Philippines in October of 1938. While she also shed light on her parents' petitioning practices that helped them escape Nazi-controlled Europe in the first place, it revealed something all the more striking. Namely that written and verbal petitioning played also a critical role in a series of interactions between individual German, Jewish, Austrian refugees in the Philippines and, in fact, Japanese fascist authorities who occupied and reinstated much remade imperialist rule on the island archipelago after the late 1941 military occupation. Shortly after the end of the fighting, Salo Kestenbaum's father, a former Tietz employee in Breslau, was dismissed from helping to run Ernst Berg's department store on Manila's Escolta Street. Berg, a German-born Gentile who had arrived in the early 1920s, did so, the daughter recalled in the interview, because her father was, quote, Jewish. While Kassel and his spouse, a convert from Protestantism, whom Berg continued to employ, debated possible ways to intervene that ultimately decided against it. There were forced into actions when the Kempeitai, so the Japanese military police, arrested Salo Kassel for changing prices at the store in an allegedly illegal manner at the onset of the Japanese occupation. Upon learning that her spouse was held in Fort Santiago, site of systematic torture and execution of prisoners, Erna Kassel, her daughter, then stressed in 2017, decided to rely on verbal entreaties articulated in person at the military police prison. The 37-year-old Westphalian did not only emphasize her Germanness. In an almost anachronistic step back to interwar petitioning practices, she also presented the Iron Cross her spouse had been awarded for wounds sustained on the Western Front in World War I. Spouses of Jewish veterans imprisoned during the November pogroms had, of course, likewise produced medals in their attempts to get their husbands released from a concentration camp. And again, Gerhard Weinberg narrated one of the stories in an earlier lecture at this conference. And it's not unlikely that Erna Kassel, in fact, had learned about this practice in this context. At a time prior to Imperial Japan's 1943 anti-Semitic turn, the practice succeeded and her husband was released. So again, before coming to an end in a minute, and I promise, this testimony, of course, should be read as, again, or this narrative version of the testimony is highly problematic. For once, of course, because it contains the stereotype of the Japanese turned us, quote unquote, into good Germans again, which many of the Manilana survivors had stated in more recent testimonies, both with Yad Vashem and also with the Holocaust Museum. In fact, Japanese perceptions of European Jewish-Japanese relations were far more complex, and especially the Japanese military police had a far different stance on it. It's also not a given, right, that German Jewish women would succeed in this overall encounter. There are many examples also in the archives of Yad Vashem, testimonies from the late 1950s, for example, by Margaret Stern, who was also imprisoned, but in fact not released and tortured and very likely sexually abused for several months, even as she was presenting her Reich German passport before managing to finally get released from Fort Santiago. Of course, what we have also quite apparent here is the appeal to Japanese masculinity and, of course, racial sentiments along different lines, whether white, yellow, as it was reinstated in this overall context. So in conclusion, since I'm already over time, the testimonies then give an indication of how we can move, I would argue, gender back from the margins to the core of Holocaust historians' work and histories. It's of course not a call for a reversed primacy of gender over race, but in fact, rather broader reflections to the complex claims and various factors to explain persecution, in which gender undoubtedly is one of the factors. At the very same time, of course, and that's also important, the introduction of gender is not just the story of gender difference. As feminist historian Gisela Borg, now German again, has reminded us in her call for a study of gender and women in the Holocaust, they are of course also subject of gender similarities as revealed in the testimony by the Manilana German Jewish survivors in the Philippines. So in this regard, then I think that the need to do so, to reintroduce gender movement from the margin to the center remains unquestionable, and I hope, of course, that this paper has taken, however, a small step in this direction. So thank you so much.